Arizona Territory, January 1886. Snow slashed sideways, biting at every seam. Laughter, coarse, close, cut through the wind. A lick of fire pulsed in a rock cleft 50 yards off the fence line. Holt McCrae drew his mare to a halt, breath smoking in the cold. He'd been riding the line because no one else would. Rifle high across his back, scarf crusted stiff with ice, he measured the wind without thinking. A lifetime habit, count the gusts, note the drift, keep moving. Tonight, though, something in that firelight made him veer. The cleft was half hidden by wind-blown sage. Inside, a young Apache woman stood with her wrists bound in rawhide. Snow powdered her hair to white, but her chin stayed high. At her throat hung a small medicine pouch stitched in the shape of an eagle's wing, beadwork bright as a coal in the gloom. 3 men had her penned in. One, tall, wolf-eyed, carbine slung lazy, grinned when he saw Holt. "Walk on," he said, voice thick with whiskey. "She ain't yours." The pouch tugged at Holt's memory, but the man's words tugged harder at his temper. He shifted his weight in the saddle, loosening the rifle sling. "You let her go," he said, flat as stone.
The tall man chuckled, nodding to his partners. "You'll want to rethink that. She's worth gold to the right buyer. Rail hands, army boys. That's the world, McCrae." Holt knew the man's face now. Maddox Kincaid, rustler turned bounty gun. Trouble for hire. Holt's hand tightened on the stock. He lowered his gaze for a breath, and in that breath he muttered the words he always kept close. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow." He squeezed. The rifle cracked, splitting the laughter in half. One of Maddox's men spun to the ground, gun skittering. The second rushed him. Holt met him halfway, boots skidding on ice, shoulder slamming into bone. They went down hard. "Run when I say," Holt told the woman without looking, cutting through the rawhide at her wrists. The rope bit his glove. The knife bit cleaner. She didn't run. She stooped instead, pulling the fallen man's revolver, eyes sharp on Maddox. Holt swung back to cover them both, snow stinging his cheeks. In the flare of the fire, he saw it, the blue wing stitching on her pouch. A jolt hit his chest. Years ago, in another winter, an Apache elder had given him beadwork like that after dragging him half dead from a canyon. He'd lost it somewhere along the line, but the pattern had stayed in his mind. Maddox staggered back toward the sage, blood dripping from a furrow along his arm. He grinned anyway, teeth bright in the dark. "You just bought yourself a war, McCrae," he said. Holt kept the rifle steady. The storm howled around them, thickening, closing the world down to the glow of the fire and the lines of their faces. Maddox's grin flattened. He backed into the white, vanishing with the wind. The woman stood beside Holt now, her breath fast but even. Snow rimmed her lashes. The revolver in her hand didn't tremble. Holt didn't ask her name, not yet. The storm had more than snow in it now. Wind clawed at the shutters, rattling them like loose teeth. Inside, pine sap hissed in the stove, throwing heat that smelled of resin and smoke. Wet wool steamed from where Holt had hung it on a peg by the door. The mare was stabled tight. The rest of the night belonged to the storm. The woman sat near the hearth, hands extended to the fire. Rawhide marks ringed her wrists, red against her skin. She hadn't said a word since they left the cleft. Holt ladled stew into a tin bowl and set it on the low table between them. "I should go," she said finally, voice low but firm. "If I stay, they'll come here. You don't want that." "You won't outrun a storm," he answered. "Not this one, not them." Her gaze held his a long moment before she looked back to the flames.
Holt pulled off his coat, set his rifle within arm's reach on the bench, and checked the door latch twice. Years of living alone had worn certain habits deep. Keep the iron close, keep the walls tight, keep to yourself. She shifted, the beaded pouch swinging slightly at her throat. Holt's eyes caught on it again. The stitching was exact, blue wing shapes curling toward each other in the center. He felt the memory rise sharp as a knife. A canyon in snow, a shadowed figure hauling him from a frozen stream, a pouch just like that pressed into his palm. "Who taught you that stitch?" he asked. "My father," she said, eyes still on the fire. Holt didn't answer. The wind moaned through the stovepipe. Something inside him shifted against its own grain. "Name's Aiyana," she said after a while. "Holt," he replied.
The names hung between them, not an introduction so much as a line drawn. She ate a few spoonfuls, then set the bowl down. "I can travel light, I've done it before." "If it comes to it," Holt said, "I'll stand in the daylight and say what I saw." Her brows pulled together, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. "That's not how it works in most towns." "I'm not most towns," he said. They let the fire speak for a while. Holt checked the latch once more, then dragged a blanket from the cot and set it near the hearth. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll keep watch." She didn't argue. Dawn seeped gray through the frost on the windows. Holt stepped outside to bring in more wood. Snow crunched under his boots, but it was the smear of ash by the creek that stopped him cold. Prince, half melted, already filling with white, feathered out from the willows and vanished toward the ridge. Someone had been here, close enough to watch the cabin through the night. He followed the line of the tracks until the wind erased them. When he came back in, Aiyana was sitting up, hair loose over her shoulders, eyes questioning. "They've been scouting," he said. She tightened the blanket around her. "Then the storm's not what we need to be worried about." Holt poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and set one in her hands. He looked once at the rifle leaning by the door, then back at her. "By the time this blows over," he said, "I'll be on one side of a line or the other." The storm had scoured the land clean, leaving the world bone white and brittle under a pale sun. Holt McCrae rode slow, his sorrel picking a careful path along the frozen arroyo. Half a mile from the north fence line, the snow broke under hoof, revealing a shape that didn't belong to the winter stillness. The man lay face down in a tangle of sagebrush, a rustler by the look of his cracked boots and patched trail coat. Holt dismounted, the cold biting his lungs as he crouched. The man's skin was already waxen, frost at the edges of his beard. No rifle, no horse. Whoever left him here had taken more than his life. Holt pulled his gloves tighter and began to dig. The ground was half frozen, the shovel ringing against hidden stones. He didn't like leaving the dead to the coyotes.
When the hole was deep enough, he rolled the body in, covering it with earth until the mound blended with the winter crust. No marker, just a prayer murmured under his breath, words from Psalm 23, carrying white into the cold air. When he straightened, Aiyana stood a few paces off, her dark hair whipped loose by the wind. She held a small clay bowl, the rim chipped, and tipped a pinch of sage ash into the snow. The smoke curled faint, a gesture of gratitude to whatever spirits watched the dead. They didn't speak until they were mounted again, heading south toward the cabin. By the time the chimney smoke came into view, Holt saw the first sign that trouble was already riding faster than the wind. Old Man Dorsey was on the cabin porch, hat in hand, his eyes shifty. "Town's talkin'," he said, rubbing his fingers together. "Maddox been in the saloon since sun up, tellin' anyone who'll listen you're keepin' a stolen Apache girl out here. Says she's wanted for knifin' one of his men." Holt's jaw tightened. "And folks believe him?" Dorsey shrugged. "He's loud."
"And you're you." Meaning a man who kept to himself,
who didn't spend Sundays at the church or coin at the mercantile unless he had to. When Dorsey left, the air inside the cabin felt heavier. Holt busied himself with stripping the tack from his horse, but the shame settled between his shoulders like a yoke. Not shame for what he'd done. He'd pulled Aiyana from a rope, and he'd do it again. But for the part of himself that once might have believed Maddox's lies without question. Aiyana moved quietly around him, setting a pot on the stove. She didn't ask what Dorsey had said. She didn't have to. Instead, she laid a hand on her eagle pouch and met his eyes with a steady calm that cut through the static in his chest. "You prayed for that man this morning," she said. "Then you buried him." "He was human," Holt replied. She nodded once, then took the kettle off the heat. "So am I." Outside, the day sank toward amber light. Holt stepped out to check the creek for ice, his boots crunching in the snow. That was when he saw it. 3 brass shells half buried in the drift, their polished sides glinting in the last of the sun. He picked one up, rolling it in his palm. The caliber was uncommon, the neck stamped with a star. Maddox's custom carbine used that exact round, which meant Maddox had been here. Not last week, not yesterday, today. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, ticking into the water barrel by the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of strong coffee and cedar smoke. Holt stripped the rifle on the table, oiling the bolt, the smell of gunmetal sharp in the warm air. Aiyana knelt by the hearth, lifting a kettle onto the trivet. She moved like someone used to making herself small, quiet feet, careful hands, but there was nothing timid in her eyes when she looked up. "You always keep your rifle that close?" she asked. Holt didn't glance from the firing pin. After today, closer. They shared a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Outside, the wind softened, letting the creek's low burble carry into the room. Holt checked the latch out of habit before sitting again. She began slicing salt pork, the blade quick and sure. "When I was a child," she said, "my father found a boy in the hills. Pale hair, maybe 16. He'd been thrown from his horse in the snow, leg broken. He could have left him. Our camp was moving ahead of cavalry, but he carried him back, set his leg, fed him until he could ride again." Holt's hands paused on the rifle stock. The story was too close. The age, the snow, the way she spoke of it. She kept working, the knife's rhythm steady. "That boy didn't know my father's name, but my father remembered his. McCrae." Holt looked at her fully then, the oil rag still in his hand. Memory flared sharp. Pain in his leg, firelight against a hide tent, a stranger's shadow bending over him, the press of a beaded pouch into his palm. He'd carried it for years before losing it to the river. "That was you," he said. "It was," she answered simply. Something inside him shifted again, a click like a lock opening. All those years he'd let prejudice run deep, never knowing the blood debt he carried. He set the rifle aside and met her gaze. "You saved me before I ever saved you," he said. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Now we are even." The words should have lightened the weight between them. Instead, they settled heavier because he knew Maddox wouldn't see it that way. Maddox didn't trade in deaths, only in grudges. Dusk crept in early, smearing violet along the ridges. Holt went outside to haul wood, stacking it by the porch. A crow shifted in the cottonwood above the creek, wings whispering. He bent for another log when a faint metallic ring threaded the air, light, quick, like a coin dropped on stone. The bell wire. He straightened slowly, eyes cutting toward the tree line. The wires were strung knee-high from post to willow, a thin line of tin bells to warn of approach. One of them had just sung. Holt's hand found the colt on his hip without thought. He scanned the timber, shadows, frost, the slow drip of meltwater, until a darker shape slid between two pines. Too far for a shot. Watching. The shape froze, then eased back into the brush, leaving nothing but the sway of needles. He backed toward the cabin, the sound of his own boots too loud. Aiyana was standing in the doorway now, her eagle pouch in her hand. She didn't ask. "Maddox has eyes on us," Holt said. Her gaze stayed on the darkening trees. "Then we'll watch back." The world was still as glass when Holt woke. No wind, no bird call, just the cold blue hush before sun touched the hills. He rose without striking a match, moving by memory, coat, hat, rifle. Aiyana was already awake, crouched by the window slit, her breath ghosting the glass. She pointed toward the creek bend, where frost rimmed the willows. "Horses," she murmured. 3 of them, picking careful steps across the shallows. The riders hunched low, blankets over their shoulders, rifles slung. Maddox colors. One man with a red scarf wound high at the throat, another with his hat brim stitched white along the edge. Holt slipped out the back door, his boots silent in the crusted snow. The ash he'd spread along the fence line was undisturbed. No one had come this way in the night. The ford was the only easy crossing for half a mile, and he'd salted it well. The first rider hit the far bank, and the ground gave way under the horse's forelegs. The beast lurched forward, and a whipcord of rawhide jerked tight between 2 buried stakes. Both horse and rider went down hard, snow exploding around them. The second man yanked his mount aside, cursing, but a thin line of wire caught his boot, snapping him clean out of the saddle. He hit the ground rolling, scrambling for his rifle. Holt's shot cracked the morning. The bullet split the ice inches from the man's hand. "Leave it," Holt called, his voice flat in the cold air. From the cottonwoods, a shadow slipped forward, Aiyana. She moved low, a coil of motion, and in 3 heartbeats she had the man's rifle in her hands. She didn't point it. She just stepped back into the trees, vanishing. The third rider reined in sharply, Maddox. Even from here, Holt could see the scar cutting his jawline. Maddox's eyes locked on Holt's, a slow smile forming despite the wreckage of his men in the snow. "You got clever," Maddox called. "Didn't think you had it in you." "You're trespassing," Holt said. Maddox's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "This ain't over." Holt didn't answer. He leveled the Winchester, sighting just off Maddox's shoulder. The warning was clear. Maddox wheeled his horse, dragging the 2 unhorsed men up behind him, retreating into the trees. The quiet rushed back in, but it wasn't the same. Holt crossed to the ford, cutting the wires and freeing the horses from the traps. He hated to snare beasts for a man's sins. When he returned to the cabin later, the sun had burned the frost from the porch. That was when he saw it, burned into the barn door, black and ugly against the weathered pine. An M inside a crude circle, Maddox's mark. Aiyana stepped out behind him, her eyes narrowing at the charred brand. He means to come back. Holt's jaw tightened. Then he'll find me ready. But even as he said it, he knew Maddox's return wouldn't just be about land or cattle or pride. Maddox had seen the 2 of them together this morning, seen the quiet understanding in the way they moved. That alone was enough to make the man dangerous. The ford had been a test. The next time would be a reckoning. The road into San Pedro was half mud, half ice, the kind of footing that made every hoof step sound louder than it should. Holt kept his gelding's pace slow, Aiyana walking beside him with her shawl drawn tight against the wind. They stayed off the main boardwalk, skirting the edges where buckboards and freight wagons left slush in deep ruts. Folks still noticed. A rancher's wife paused in the act of sweeping her stoop, her eyes narrowing before she turned her back. Two men by the saloon rail leaned on their elbows, trading a look that Holt had seen in more than one cattle town. Half curiosity, half something meaner. "You don't have to walk this stretch," Holt said quietly. "If I leave now, they'll talk twice as much," Aiyana replied, her voice even. They passed the blacksmiths, the ring of hammer on iron chasing them toward the mercantile. Inside, the air was warmer but no softer. The shopkeep's greeting was flat. His gaze flicked from Holt to Aiyana and back again. She kept her chin up, moving straight to the dry goods shelf. Holt followed, taking more stock of the other customers than the flour sack in his hands. At the far counter, a woman in a worn gray dress wrapped a spool of thread and tucked it into a paper packet. When her eyes met Aiyana's, she didn't look away. "If you need bandages, I've some clean ones in the back," she said gently. "Thank you," Aiyana answered, the first hint of warmth in her voice since they'd entered town. They stepped back out into the pale winter sun, Holt noting the shadow of the church spire stretching across the road. Pastor Wright was there, speaking with a pair of drovers.
He gave Holt a single measured nod, nothing more, but enough to say he saw and wasn't turning away. It wasn't much, but in a place like this, it was a bridge. They made it as far as the livery before a rider came hard down the street, throwing mud in his wake. The man pulled up sharp beside Holt, breath steaming from both horse and rider. "You McCrae?" the rider asked. Holt's hand hovered near his coat. "Depends." "Name's Finch. Maddox sent word." He stopped himself, glancing at Aiyana, then lowered his voice. "He's got 7 men riding in from Agua Fria. Says they'll be at your place before moonrise." Holt didn't blink. "You one of them?" "Not anymore," Finch said. "Figured I'd rather bring a warning than get shot over Maddox's grudge." He wheeled his horse and was gone, leaving only the churned slush where his gelding had stood. Aiyana was watching Holt closely now. 7 men? 7 he's bragging about, Holt said. Could be more. They cut straight back to the horses, making for the east road out of town. Behind them, the church bell tolled the noon hour, sharp and cold in the air. It sounded too much like a countdown. The sky had that greenish tint that meant the weather was turning mean. Clouds stacked heavy over the rim, their bellies dragging low. Holt could smell rain in the wind, sharp and metallic. He started with the shutters, driving home the last of the iron hooks he'd forged himself. Aiyana stood at the doorway, coiling baling wire in neat loops. She didn't ask what each thing was for, just handed tools when his hand went out, silent as any partner who knew time was short. The ash from the stove went next, spread in thin lines across the yard where snow had melted to dirt. It would darken underfoot, the faintest crunch warning them of anyone creeping close. By the fence line, Holt set 2 dummies with lanterns on posts, shapes a rifleman might mistake for men. Beyond that, he rigged the sledge traps. Heavy timbers balanced to swing down from the corral rails if the trip ropes were pulled. When he came back to the porch, Aiyana was waiting with a strip of clean linen in her hands. "Let me see your side," she said. "I'm fine." "You move like you're not." Holt hesitated, then sat on the steps, unbuttoning his shirt. The cold bit at his skin, but her hands were warm as she worked. She bound the cloth tight around his ribs, her fingertips brushing old scar tissue. "That one?" she asked, nodding toward a jagged mark along his flank. "Fall from a green horse, long time ago." She smiled faintly. "And yet you still ride." "Some things you keep doing," Holt said, meeting her eyes, "even after they've thrown you hard." For a moment they didn't speak. The storm grumbled somewhere west, low and long. She tied off the bandage and let her hands rest there just a second longer than she had to. Back inside, Holt checked the Winchester's action, set cartridges in rows on the table. Aiyana fetched water from the pump, filling the kettles and the wash basin. Everything they could need for a long night was placed within reach.
Dusk came early under the storm. The wind pushed against the walls, searching for cracks. Holt stepped out to the yard one last time, eyes on the ridge. The lightning came without thunder first, just a white flash that carved the world in sharp lines. 7 riders, dark against the horizon. They weren't coming fast, not yet, but the way they held their formation, tight and steady, told Holt all he needed to know.
Maddox had them in hand, and Maddox meant to finish what he'd started. He felt the knot in his chest go still. No more guessing, no more waiting. The fight was coming home. The light was almost gone, that thin blue between day and night when shadows sharpen before they disappear. Inside the cabin, the fire was banked low, throwing more glow than heat. Holt sat at the table with the circuit judge's next route laid out in pencil on a scrap of brown paper. "When he rides through," Holt said, tapping the mark for San Pedro, "I'll be there. You tell your story straight, and I'll back it. Every word. Maddox won't twist it into something it's not." Aiyana shook her head. "Telling it won't make them believe me." "It'll make the law hear you," Holt said, "and that's the first step." She studied him for a moment. "What if the town turns on you for it?" He leaned back in his chair. "They've turned before. I'm still here." The wind scratched at the shutters, a restless sound. Aiyana rose and crossed to the door. From her neck she lifted the eagle pouch, the leather worn smooth with years of touch. She hung it on the peg beside the latch.
"My father told me you hang what matters by the door," she said, "so you never leave without it." Holt stood, crossed to the small chest in the corner, and took out a narrow strip of beadwork, faded reds and blues on elk hide. He hadn't looked at it in years. Without a word, he hung it beside her pouch. They stood there for a moment, side by side, their tokens swaying in the draft. "This isn't just your fight," Holt said quietly. Her voice was just above the crackle of the fire. "It is now." The last of the light drained from the windows, and the cabin seemed to draw in on itself, each sound sharper. Holt loaded the Winchester with steady hands, the brass rounds clicking home one by one. Aiyana moved to the hearth, pulling her hair back with a leather tie. The glow caught the angle of her cheek, the set of her mouth. She didn't look afraid, not in the way Holt had seen fear before. She looked resolved. Outside, the yard was still. So still that the first sound was like a whisper, a faint clink. Then another, softer. Holt's eyes flicked to Aiyana. She had heard it too. The tripwire bells strung between the cottonwoods were speaking, each note a warning. He crossed to the window, careful not to show himself. Out there, past the dark line of the fence, the shadows were moving, slow, patient. He reached back without looking, felt Aiyana press the second rifle into his hand. "Here we go," Holt murmured, and the siege began. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The first shot split the silence like a whip crack. A bullet punched into the porch post inches from Holt's head. He rolled to the side, working the Winchester's lever without haste, counting the seconds between muzzle flashes. Lightning flared over the Mogollon rim, and in that harsh blue-white light, the 7 riders became 2 flanking wings, 4 swinging wide toward the barn, 3 cutting for the house. Holt's gut tightened. They weren't just charging, they were closing a noose. The barn lantern, the one he'd set swinging from a rafter, caught their eye first. Gunfire shredded the empty stalls, hay flying in golden arcs under the muzzle bursts. Good. Let them waste powder on shadows. From the shadowed porch, Holt fired once, twice. A rider pitched sideways off his horse. Another clutched his thigh and wheeled away. He kept his fire slow, conserving rounds, every pull of the trigger deliberate. Somewhere behind him, the back door eased shut without a sound. Aiyana was already gone, ghosting along the creek line just as they'd agreed. If she could work in close, they might split Maddox's men before they breached. But the barn wasn't just a decoy anymore. Flames licked up the hayloft ladder, catching fast in the dry timber. Smoke curled low across the yard, stinging Holt's eyes. It would push them out if he didn't end this fast. The front wing of riders broke away, leaving 2 sprawled in the mud. Holt scanned for the others, and that's when the porch floor shuddered. A figure slammed through the back door hard enough to splinter the frame. Maddox Kincaid filled the threshold, a double-barreled shotgun leveled from the hip. His face was pale in the firelight, a smear of blood along his jaw where Holt's bullet had grazed him days ago. "You just won yourself a burial spot right here, McCrae," Maddox growled, voice low and sure. Holt didn't answer. The hallway behind him was too tight, no room to dodge if Maddox pulled both triggers. The heat from the burning barn pressed at his back, the reek of smoke clawing his throat. This was it. No more fence-sitting, no more distance. Maddox was inside his home. Holt shifted his weight, feeling the Winchester's last round slide into the chamber. The next move would decide everything. The cabin's back hall was barely shoulder-wide, lit only by the faint spill of fire from the main room. Smoke from the burning barn filtered through every crack, carrying the sharp tang of pitch and scorched hay. Holt's boots scraped against the plank floor as he backed away, Winchester held low. Maddox came on steady, the double-barreled shotgun cradled in his arms like it belonged there. He wasn't rushing, no need. The hallway funneled Holt into a dead end, the kitchen wall at his back. "Not much room to dance here, McCrae," Maddox said, voice oily. "I'll give you credit. You held on longer than most." Holt's reply was a dry rasp. "Still holding." The shotgun roared. Even braced, the blast felt like a mule kick in the ribs. The right barrel's buckshot tore into the wall, but a few pellets grazed Holt's side, hot slivers of pain biting through flesh. He staggered, shoulder slamming the hall frame. His fingers clenched harder on the rifle to keep from dropping it. The smell of burned powder hung thick, ears ringing from the concussion in the narrow space. Maddox thumbed back the second hammer, slow and deliberate. "You could have walked away," Maddox said, taking another step forward. "Handed over the girl, kept your place, lived quiet. But no, you had to play hero." Holt's breath came shallow, the ache in his ribs flaring with each inhale. The truth was simple. Part of him feared not the pain, but losing the one thing he'd barely dared to want, a home with someone worth keeping it for. Smoke curled past his boots, a creeping reminder that the fire outside was hungry for more than just the barn. The shotgun's muzzle lifted to chest height. Maddox's finger tightened. And then, a sound behind him. It was faint, but Holt caught it. The whisper of leather on wood, the smallest shift of weight. A shadow slid into view at Maddox's back, lean, low, moving with the patience of a hunter. Aiyana's hair caught the firelight from the window, a thin halo around the glint of steel in her hand. She was within striking distance. Maddox didn't know. The steel in Aiyana's hand caught a tongue of firelight, a single flash before it vanished into shadow again. She moved without sound, each step measured so the boards wouldn't creak. Maddox shifted his stance to fire, and that was when she struck. The bone-handled knife darted low, slicing across the back of his knee just deep enough to drop him without spilling more than a line of blood. Maddox roared, buckling forward as his leg betrayed him. The shotgun fired wild into the ceiling, plaster dust snowing down in choking clouds. Holt surged forward, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He slammed Maddox shoulder first into the stone hearth. The impact rang through the cabin like an anvil strike. Maddox's grip faltered, the shotgun clattering across the floorboards. For a heartbeat, all three froze in the haze. The only sound the distant crackle of the burning barn. Maddox's hand twitched toward the pistol on his belt. Aiyana's knife was still in her grip, its point leveled at his throat. Her eyes were dark, unblinking.
It would be so easy. One motion, and the man who'd hunted her, who'd set fire to their refuge, would never harm anyone again. Holt saw the decision weigh in her shoulders. He knew the choice. Vengeance was a door you couldn't close once you stepped through. Slowly, she lowered the blade. "No," she said, voice steady, "not like him." Maddox spat on the floor, but his bravado was fraying. The shouts outside had thinned. Through the cracked shutters, Holt glimpsed figures in the yard, hesitating, watching their leader brought low. The barn's flames roared higher, sending waves of heat into the cabin. A spark popped from the hearth, catching briefly on a rug before dying. The air felt thick, the smoke heavy enough to taste. Holt kicked the pistol away from Maddox's reach. "You're done," he said, his voice like stone. Outside, the remaining gunmen shifted, some edging toward the dark line of the trees. The tide was turning, but the fire outside was creeping closer, and the night wasn't finished with them yet. Holt shoved Maddox toward the corner, binding his hands with a length of rawhide torn from a saddle strap. The man cursed, but the fight had gone out of him.
Smoke thickened inside, so Holt kicked the door open and stepped into the yard. Winchester raised. The night was chaos, barn timbers collapsing in a shower of sparks, wind driving smoke low across the ground. Figures darted between the fence posts, their shapes jagged against the firelight. Holt's boots crunched on frost-hardened earth as he moved toward the fence line. The first man to come through the gate tripped a taut wire hidden in the dark. The sledge trap Holt had rigged, a weighted timber swinging from a pulley, slammed into the fence rails, shattering them and hurling the attacker to the ground. Another rider tried to skirt wide, but his horse screamed as it hit the ash spread Holt had laid earlier. Hooves slipped, sending both down in a tangle. From the far side, two men broke for the creek, desperate for cover. Holt watched their shadows lengthen on the ice, and then heard the sharp crack. The surface gave way, plunging them into black water. Their shouts turned to gasps, the cold seizing faster than any bullet. The rest hesitated, the will to fight draining from them with each failed push. One fired a last defiant shot before melting into the tree line. Holt's breath steamed in the frigid air. He lowered the Winchester, feeling the quiet creep back in, the first quiet since the siege began. Beside him, Aiyana emerged from the smoke, her bow in hand, two unspent arrows still clutched tight. She scanned the yard, then turned her face upward. In Apache, she murmured a short prayer, thanking the land for its shelter, the cold for its shield. Holt nodded, the words of a psalm half formed on his lips. "You have been my fortress in the day of trouble," he whispered, voice rough. And then the ground shifted under him. No, not the ground, but his knees. The world tilted, dark at the edges. Warmth spread under his coat, slick and steady. Aiyana caught his arm as he sagged. "Holt!" He tried to answer, but the words drowned in the rush in his ears. The last thing he saw was the faint glow of the horizon, and her face set hard against the fear, before the dark pulled him under. Lantern light wavered across the cabin walls, shadows long and restless. Aiyana knelt beside Holt on the bed, her hands steady though her breath came fast. She'd cut away the torn shirt, exposing the ragged groove along his ribs where buckshot had grazed deep. Blood welled with each heartbeat. hot against the chill in the room. "Stay with me," she said, voice low but sharp with command. She'd seen men fade before, in the mountains, in the desert, and she knew the signs. Keep them talking, keep them anchored. Holt forced one eye open. "I'm not going anywhere." "That's not the same as staying alive," she muttered, threading a curved needle with sinew thread. She worked with sure movements, cleaning the wound with boiled water, stitching flesh in neat, ruthless passes. Holt grunted once but didn't flinch. He watched her face in the lamplight, the focus, the stubborn line of her jaw. "You're good at this," he managed. "I've had to be." She tied off the stitch, pressing a folded linen tight to staunch the seep. "Your people, my people, sometimes we only have each other." He closed his eyes briefly, hearing more in her words than she spoke. When they opened again, his voice was quieter, stripped of any frontier gruffness. "I don't want to ride alone anymore." The needle paused in her hand. She looked at him, really looked, and in that moment the air between them shifted.
No grand declaration, no plea, just the plain truth laid bare in the still hour before dawn. Aiyana set the needle aside and adjusted the bandage, wrapping it snug around his ribs. She draped his coat over him, tucking it close against the cold. Across the room, Maddox lay on the floor, wrists bound behind him, ankles tied. His eyes glittered in the half-light, face twisted in a mix of pain and spite. "You too make a fine picture," he sneered. "Shame it ends with you handing me over to a judge who'll cut me loose in a week." Holt didn't look at him. "Maybe, but you're going to face the law before you face the Almighty." Outside, the first smear of pale light touched the frosted window pane. The siege was over, but the reckoning was not. At daybreak, they would ride and decide whether Maddox met justice in town or on the road. Frost crackled under each step as Holt and Aiyana hauled Maddox out into the yard. The fire in the barn had burned itself down to a black skeleton, smoke rising in slow coils into the paling sky. Holt's side throbbed with every move, the fresh bandages warm under his coat, but his grip on Maddox's rope was steady.
Aiyana walked on the other side, her bow slung but ready. Between them, Maddox stumbled once, twice, the rawhide biting his wrists. They reached the narrow trail toward town just as the sun broke over the Magellan rim. Gold spilled across the frost-white fields, turning each breath into a puff of steam. The cold bit sharp, but the light felt clean after the smoke-choked night. Halfway down the trail, the creak of wagon wheels broke the stillness. Two teamsters appeared, hauling a load of winter hay. At the sight of the trio, the older driver pulled up his reins. "Morden McCrae," he called, eyes flicking to Maddox. "Heard shots in the night." "Trouble came callin'," Holt answered. "It's ridin' into town with us." The teamsters exchanged a look, then fell in alongside without a word. Witnesses were worth more than bullets when it came to the judge's bench. By the time they reached the San Pedro crossing, the sky was full daylight. The river ice gleamed like glass, the water whispering beneath. The first buildings of town rose beyond, mercantile, livery, church steeple cutting into the cold blue above. A figure stepped out from the church steps, the pastor, coat buttoned to his chin, Bible tucked under one arm. He came down slow, eyes moving from Holt's face to Aiyana's, then to Maddox. "No need to ask who won," he said, voice even. "No winners," Holt replied, "just the truth." As they passed the mercantile, a handful of townsfolk stepped onto the boardwalk, murmuring to each other. Holt saw the shift in their eyes, some surprise, some relief, maybe even respect. The story was walking right past them in daylight, and daylight had a way of burning off lies. They reached the edge of the square, where the circuit judge held court when the weather allowed. A rough plank table stood ready, gavel waiting. Holt and Aiyana brought Maddox forward. The man's smirk had faded, replaced by a tight jaw. The pastor took his place beside the judge's stand. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, and until it did, justice was still only a promise. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0.
The circuit judge's table was nothing more than a plank set across 2 sawhorses, but it might as well have been the bench in Washington for the weight it carried this morning. Holt stood to one side, hat in hand, ribs bound tight under his coat. Aiyana was beside him, her hair neatly braided, the eagle medicine pouch resting at her hip. The town gathered close, boots creaking on frost, and breath ghosting in the air. The pastor opened with a brief prayer for truth to guide the proceedings, then stepped back. Maddox sat in front of the judge, wrists shackled, face pale under the winter sun. His lawyer, a wiry man with eyes like pinheads, tried to turn the talk toward misunderstandings and frontier tensions. But testimony piled like snow on a pine bough. The teamsters swore to seeing Maddox bound and under Holt's guard before dawn. A widow from the mercantile recalled the night Holt had carried her husband home after a mining collapse, arguing it spoke to his character. Even the young deputy brought forward Maddox's custom carbine, the rifling marks matching spent shells found near Holt's Creek. The verdict came without spectacle. The judge simply nodded, signed the order, and passed the papers to the sheriff. Maddox would ride under guard to Prescott, there to face territorial sentencing. The man's eyes found Holt's as they led him away, but whatever threat he meant to speak died behind his teeth. By noon, the square had emptied, the frost melting into muddy ruts. Holt and Aiyana walked back the road to the ranch, the air crisp with pine. Spring brought new timbers for the barn, squared by hand and set in place with steady work. Holt built a loft for hay, a sheltered stall for the mare Aiyana favored. Under the eaves, she tied bundles of dried sage and cedar, their scent mingling with fresh-cut pine. They worked side by side, hauling water, mending fence, laying seed rows in the thawed earth. Holt began to leave the cabin door unlatched during the day, a silent sign the place was no longer a fortress against the world, but a home that welcomed the right kind of company. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, they sat with the pastor in the back room of the small clapboard church. No congregation, no public vow, just a few words spoken with sincerity, asking the Lord's blessing over the path they would walk together. Aiyana brought a small bowl of river water and a sprig of willow, setting them on the table as she spoke in her own tongue, weaving her people's custom into the moment. The pastor bowed his head in respect. Late that summer, a new sign rose at the ranch gate: McCrae's Crossing, water and bread for travelers. The letters were carved deep and blackened with lamp soot, easy to read from the trail. Beneath it hung a small tin cup and a shelf for a loaf. Riders began to know the place, a spot where a stranger might find a drink, a bite, and perhaps a word of scripture if they cared to hear it. The land hadn't changed. The winters would still cut deep. The ridges would still cast long shadows at dusk. But the man who rode its fence line had. Frost feathered the edges of the windows, the hearth giving off a steady glow that held the cold at bay. Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek had long since shed their leaves, their bare limbs scratching the pale sky. Inside, Holt sat near the fire, a length of worn tack stretched across his knees. The leather was cracked in places, the stitching frayed, but his hands worked patiently, mending each seam as if the piece might serve another lifetime. On the low table beside him lay a half-finished cradle, oak sides smoothed by draw knife, the ends carved with a running stag motif. Across the room, Aiyana knelt on a braided rug, a small charcoal slate propped on her lap.
She traced letters for a neighbor's boy, the child mouthing each one in slow rhythm. In the evenings now, it wasn't uncommon for the ranch to hold more than 2 voices. Travelers stopping in, neighbors sharing coffee, a few children learning their first words in English. Holt found he liked the sound. The days moved with the quiet certainty of the season. Wood was stacked high under the lean-to. Dried beans and sacks of flour lined the pantry shelves. Bundles of sage hung in the rafters beside strips of smoked venison. Holt had learned the pattern of her ways, how she would sprinkle cedar ash before the doorway during the first snow, how she hummed in Apache while grinding corn, how she paused at dusk to watch the ridgeline as if listening for something older than the land itself.
One night, while snow fell in small, soundless flakes, Holt stood in the doorway watching the sky. "Used to think the only debt I had was to myself," he said, his voice low. "Turns out I owed more than I knew, and not just for a life once saved." Aiyana looked up from the cradle, meeting his gaze. "Debts are only heavy if we leave them unpaid," she said. "You've paid yours, in the way you live now." He nodded, the truth of it settling in his chest like the warmth from the hearth. As Advent came on, the air grew sharper, the mornings edged with ice. One afternoon, a skein of geese passed overhead, their formation cutting a deep V across the clean winter sky. The sound of their calls carried over the ranch, a reminder of far places and long roads. By the cabin door, the eagle medicine charm hung in its usual place, the beaded loop Holt had once carried, stitched now into its leather edge. The pouch turned gently in the breeze, beads catching the pale light, the feathers whispering against the wood. Some who passed by would notice it and ask about its meaning. Holt would tell them, if they cared to hear, that it was a reminder of a night when mercy had outweighed vengeance, when strangers had stood back to back against the dark, and when the Lord's hand had been on them both. The land would keep its storms, the trail its dangers, but here at McCrae's Crossing the door would stay open, the water bucket full, and the bread fresh on the shelf. And if a traveler lingered long enough, they might see, in the quiet between the wind and the fire, that a man once alone had found more than company. He had found a way home. Maybe you've walked a road like Holt's. Maybe you've carried the weight of a past you couldn't quite put down, debts unpaid, words unsaid, fences never mended. Life out here on the frontier could grind a man down until all he had left was the dust under his boots and the silence of an empty cabin. But sometimes the Lord sends someone across your path, not with fanfare, but in the quiet of an unexpected moment. And if you open the door, even a crack, you find that grace has been waiting there all along. The true West wasn't only about gunfights and gold strikes. It was about folks learning to trust, to lay down grudges, to give and receive help across the divides of blood, language, and history. Holt's story isn't just a tale of survival. It's a reminder that courage often looks like kindness, and that justice without mercy can leave a soul colder than any prairie winter. If you've felt that truth in your own bones, then you understand why we tell these true Wild West stories. They're not just history. They're mirrors, showing us who we were, who we are, and who we might still become. So if this story stirred something in you, a memory, a prayer, a hope, I invite you to share it. Pass it along. Keep the fire of these tales burning. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to be reminded that even on the loneliest trail, there's still a way home.